Hello and well met. This is Founder Leroon with Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to go over a little bit of things about movement. I'm using the D&D 5e rule set, so this might be a little different if you're playing Pathfinder or a different rule set, but some of this stuff might apply. So first things first, a lot of people have a confusion about how movement works. I think it's a lot to do with still getting used to the interface and also not remembering some of the shortcuts. So we'll go through movement and also some tips and also some other options that may affect movement. So the first things first, when you first start a Fantasy Grounds session and you set up your table, you need to put all of your combatants and your players on the combat tracker. Once they're on the combat tracker, drag them over and put them on the map. That is how you create the link between your tokens and the combat tracker. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes when you update your software or if you add an extension or maybe you've had someone drop out of your game or something, it can break the link between the player and the map and the combat tracker. So you would simply just right click, delete the token, and you can delete all of them at once or one at a time. I recommend one at a time so you can remember their relative position. But if you want to delete all of them, you just right-click on a token, click Delete Token, and you can delete all, or you can delete this. So I'm just going to delete all for now. So if for some reason you can't move or your players can't move your tokens, try that first and then put them back on the table. So I'm going to drag them. Oops, it's the wrong one. Okay. So you're going to drag the token onto the map, and then you can drag them one at a time to their relative location about where they were last time. And if you do it one at a time when you delete them, it's easier to keep track of. So that's important right there. That step helps ensure that those are linked to the map. If there's no link to the map, there's no way to track between the token and the combat tracker. So that's an important piece. That has to do with damage and targeting and all kinds of stuff. So now the other thing is movement. Depending on what your options are and what rule set you have, if you scroll down to the options, which is up here, this is the gear cog. And when you bring up the options, this is what you see. And down at the bottom, there is a movement setting under the house rules. It is called Map Diagonal Distance. I have it on variant. There's raw and there's standard. When you first load Fantasy Grounds, standard is what is normally enabled. So what that means is when I hit Alt and I move one of these tokens, it will move diagonally to there. And that's 30 feet. Now just remember that Fantasy Grounds does not limit your movement. Even if your character sheet says 30 feet, it's not going to prevent you from moving further. It's not going to prevent you from moving walls if there's no line of sight there. This is a gentleman's game or a everyone's game, and it's one of those things where if your players cannot adhere to that, then that's a whole nother issue. So the movement is not controlled by Fantasy Grounds. It is merely tracked. And this is kind of a rough way to track things. So moving diagonally with the diagonal distance on standard allows you to move your maximum 30 feet, and that's that. But if you really calculate this and do the math, you're actually moving much further. You're moving like 45 feet or something like that. So if I switch this diagonal distance to variant, now you get 40. And the reason for that is triangle, Pythagorean's theorem. So if you move diagonally, you're moving the longest distance between the two vertices here. So if you think of this as a triangle, that's basically what's happening is you're moving 1.5 times the distance. So if you have it on variant, that's a lot closer to true movement. And in this case, this goblin wouldn't be moving there. So I would click the X to cancel the movement. And then I'd have that player or the NPC redraw. So I'm going to hold down Control for a second. And I'm moving the token to the appropriate position. Well, before he was way over here, another 10 feet above. So that is something you can do. And the other variation is raw. Raw keeps track of every little single movement. So if you go like this, and then back, and then forth, and then over here, and then over here, and over here, it's going to keep track of every little movement. So it's more realistic as far as time goes, is that it's keeping track of where you've gone in a short amount of distance. If you're just kind of milling about in a closed, tight area, or maybe you have to be that precise, maybe a space battle or something. So those are 3 settings that affect movement. Another thing that affects movement is walls. So if you have line of sight enabled, and that's in your line of sight tools for the map tools. And if you go here, here's some terrain that is put on this. So this is really not a good example of how this might work. But terrain only limits what you see. It doesn't limit how you move onto that surface. So that's something that you have to take in consideration. However, if you are a player or an NPC or anything like that, the DM, or I think the players might be able to do this too, is you need to hold shift. So you hold down the shift key, and that will allow you to move through the wall. That way you're able to move at an accelerated rate. You don't have to go through all the doors and stuff. Because if you try to move through the wall, it's going to stop. And as a game master and a player, I know you know what I'm talking about if you've played before. So that is the key to that. So when you go to shift and hold, if you want to move through walls or barriers, you hold the shift and single left click and hold your mouse button, and then you hold it down on a token, and you drag it through the obstacle or the barrier. So that's a GM only option. The next thing I was going to discuss is move your NPC to show the distance moved marker. You hold the shift and single left click on a token to initiate the colored movement path. Once the movement is started, you do not need to keep holding down the mouse button. So what that means is if you are in the middle of moving this goblin, and you have to be in play mode, so I can't move anything because I'm not in play mode. So that's one of my tips, is you need to change this to play and grab one of the tokens, then you can move it. Now, if you just move it like this without holding shift, it does not keep track of the goblin's movement. You have to hold down the Alt key. So I'm going to hold Alt, and once I initiate that movement, I no longer have to hold down the Alt key. I can just move this to where it needs to go. So he gets to move 25 feet, and that's a legal movement, and there we go. And then I approve it. Now, if this person decides that they want to go through somebody, let's just, for example, let's say this player says, well, I want to move on the other side of him. So he's going to hold down the shift key or the Alt key if you're a DM. If you were a player and you were going to move your character, you don't have to worry about it. So let's just say that Dorg wants to move through this goblin. So as the game master, I do have to hold down the Alt key. Now that is not a legal movement. You cannot move through an enemy. You can move through an ally, but not an enemy. So if you move through an ally, there's a little penalty for rough terrain. But if this was my game, for example, I would not allow this movement. I would cancel it, and I would ask that player to redraw. So I would go ahead and say, go ahead, you can't move through there, so you're going to have to go around him. So he'll probably get frustrated, but you're going to move this way. You can move diagonally and then move. But see, as you cut through, that's not what you're doing. You want to move more like that. And that's a legal movement, and I would allow that because you're moving around the target, but then you also might open yourself up to an attack of opportunity. So that's a whole other thing. But nonetheless, if these two allies want to move through each other, so the NPCs, if I hold down the Alt key and I start moving this one, and then he decides he wants to go diagonal, he can move through there. However, he can only move there. He's losing 10 feet because of difficult terrain. So he can still move through his ally. That just means it slowed him down and he lost 10 feet of movement. That's roughly about what the loss is. Sometimes I might adjudicate 5 feet or 15 feet even, depending on the situation. But normally it's 10 feet. So that all depends on how you run your table and how you want things to go. So again, I'm going to bring back up that thing. This is the graph thing I'm designing here. So this is the infographic. So shift plus hold. So you move your tokens through walls or barriers as a game master. You can hold shift and the single left click and hold your mouse button down on a token to drag it through a wall or a barrier. So if you have a wall through line of sight or a barrier of some sort, you can move your token through there. Now, when you are in this map mode and you're creating content or you're adjusting the map, you cannot move any tokens because you are no longer on the token layer. You must be on the play mode for that to work. The other thing that I think most GMs don't realize is when you're in this type of position here and you do have line of sight, you want to hold and enable some of these different line of sight things. So this is the goblin's vision right now. So I have this token selected and he has his all the line of sight and is enabled. He cannot see any further than that because that's his vision range, and he can't move through these unless he climbs up on the tower, and then I will open this terrain. So when you're moving, you need to be in play mode, and you need to have some of this line of sight, the lighting, and this is the player view. So if I turn off the player view, this is the game master view. So I don't really see, I can see the silhouette over here of the lighting, but I do not see the rest of the effects. Unless you can toggle so it doesn't have to be permanent. You can hit Control P just to get an idea of what they see at that moment, and then run the rest of the encounter like this, so without the player vision. The only time the DM really needs player vision if they ask a question or if there's something out of view. Maybe they'll ask you if they can see something or anything like that. You hit down, you hold down Control and you hold down P temporarily, and it's just a toggle so you can go back and forth between the vision types. But this is assuming that the line of sight is set up correctly and that you have the enabled the line of sight and the lighting on. If you don't have those on, this isn't going to function properly. And you also have to have barriers, and you can also adjust the ambient light. So right now, if I go to the light tool and I go to the sunshine icon, which is the ambient lighting, it's off right now. If I turn that on, it's going to default to daytime. So the sun is coming from this direction up here. And then if I want to change that preset, I can change it. I can go to dawn, or I can go to moonlight, which is more of a darkness thing. And if I hit Control P, it's a little bit darker. So you can affect the outdoor ambient light. However, when you have structures that are both in and out, that makes it difficult. So this wasn't meant to be a lesson in line of sight, but it does affect your movement if you can't see where you're going. So I did mention that. So again, let's recap. So when you first get Fantasy Grounds up and running and you get your encounter set up, you're going to make sure that the combatants and the players are on the combat tracker. Once that's done, you move them over onto the map, and then when you're going to move, a player can just simply move their token and it'll automatically draw the location. So for players, just keep in mind that you cannot move through walls, you cannot move through allies without penalty, and you cannot move through enemies at all. For game masters, if you want to move through a wall to get somebody somewhere quicker without having to go through all the obstacles, just hold down the shift key and that will let you pass through a barrier temporarily so that you can get where you need to go. Also, if you are going to be using NPCs and moving them, you need to click on the token, hold down the Control key, and then start your movement. Once you start your movement, you don't have to keep holding the key down, and then you can just drag where you want to go. Now, there are occasions where you have to change your your path. So for instance, if there was something in the way by the time he made his move, he could actually shift this over, these waypoints, and that allows him to adjust where he moved to. This doesn't come up very often, but it can, and as you can see, the total adds up. So you can't move beyond where you're not supposed to move beyond the actual movement that you're supposed to go per round, unless you have a potion or something magic, or your DM says, yeah, go ahead and move an extra 5 feet. So these are just tips about movement. The other thing is when you are in the map mode, so right now this is not in the map editing mode, but if you uncheck this or unclick it and you unlock this, you will have these enabled line of sight and all that. When you're in this mode, you can actually move things around. If you switch to line of sight or the lighting tool, you cannot move the tokens. So keep that in mind. If you lose the ability to move, make sure that you're in play mode if you're editing a map or in the middle of something. Okay, once that's done, if you lock it, then you can move. So it's not a big deal after that. The other thing is, once in a while, you will lose movement or your players can't move. What you'll need to do in that case is, like I said, if it doesn't resolve itself, or if you basically restart Fantasy Grounds and it still doesn't work, remove all of the players that are having issues moving, right-click, delete their token, and then re-drag them to the spot they were at. And that will usually clear it up. Not always, but usually. And then you can just re-drag them onto the combat tracker. Hopefully you don't have to do this in the middle of a battle, because that's no fun. But nonetheless, it does happen occasionally where the link gets corrupted between the combat tracker and the map. And that's really all you have to really consider, is that when you're moving, you're playing by a set of rules that are interpreted differently by different rule sets and different people. Your game master might be a little more flexible. And when you want to keep from having to lock and keep track of movement, if you just want your players to move freely, there is a token lock mode where you can unlock it and then the players can move wherever they want. So that, well, within reason. But that's basically a toggle that you can turn that feature on or off. It won't track the movement very well, but it does lock and unlock the tokens so that they can move freely. So maybe when you're role-playing and you're not in combat, you'll want to unlock it. But once combat starts, you can turn the lock back on and allow your players to keep going. So again, in the options, you have most rule sets, not all, but you have the ability to switch the type of movement. So it's either standard, you just move as you are. Variant will count every other square as 10 feet. And raw keeps track of every little movement that you make. So that's basically your 3 options. I usually go to variant because I think that's more accurate in most cases. But if you're playing a highly technical combat game, like a battle game or ship-to-ship combat, you might have to use raw so that you can track every little variation. So that's pretty much all I have. Hopefully that explains some things and it gives you some ideas of how to move things, or at least to troubleshoot when you're having problems. So shift plus hold to move through barriers. Control plus hold to move NPCs or players as the game master. And then a pro tip is, if you cannot move your tokens while in the map tools, make sure you are in play mode, which is the dice, especially if you're in the middle of editing a map or something like that. Usually people forget what mode they're in, or they don't pay attention to it, and they try to move and they're like, oh, I can't move. Well, that's why, usually. So that's something that you may want to pay attention to in the future if you're having issues with it. And again, if your link breaks between the combat tracker and the battle map, remove those guys temporarily off the map. Not off the combat tracker, but off the map. And then relink them by dragging them back on the map. And that's all I have today. Hopefully that's helpful. Take care, everybody. Happy gaming and enjoy.